It's been a hostile relationship for more than 5 decades. The United States and Cuba, led by the Castros, and has also bedeviled our politics at home. From the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 to the Cuban Missile Crisis that brought us to the brink of nuclear war, to CIA plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, to the 1999 saga over 6-year-old Elian Gonzalez, foreign policy with Cuba has seemed like an unfixable problem. But now, a new chapter. The U.S. and Cuba will reestablish relations. So far, the political reaction is mixed and mostly harshly critical from the GOP. Senator Jeff Flake said the policy is right. Senator Bob Corker says he's closely examining the implications of these major policy changes, while Speaker Boehner called it another in a long line of mindless concessions to a dictatorship. But that was nothing compared to what we heard from Florida Senator Marco Rubio.
This president has proven today that his foreign policy is more than just naive. It is willfully ignorant of the way the world truly works. This president is the single worst negotiator we have had in the White House in my lifetime, who has basically given the Cuban government everything it asked for and received no assurances of any advances in democracy and freedom in return.
Senator Rubio's parents are Cuban immigrants, but he is out of step with the American people. 56% of Americans support normalizing relations with Cuba. Polls of Cuban Americans show similar numbers. The president is doing the right thing, and the American people agree. Joining me now are the Washington Post's Jonathan Capehart and Julia Swig, a senior fellow on foreign relations and author of Cuba, What Everyone Needs to Know. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Fred.
Julia, is President Obama's policy change here really just catching up to the 21st century?
I think that puts it exactly succinctly, Reverend Sharpton. It's catching up to the 21st century, and it's catching up to where the body politic in the United States and in Cuba already is. This is the right time to move, and it's the right time from the perspective of Latin America as well, where I think our regional standing will get a big boost. We'll be able to take a bothersome, difficult problem off the table and start to have a much more productive conversation in the region, and clearly with Cuba as well.
Jonathan, it's really hard to overstate the weight and gravity and history of this policy that has weighed on this country for many a year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as the president pointed out, this is a policy that's been in place for longer than a lot of people in this country have been alive. I think he said in his remarks that he was about 2 or 3 years old when the policy kicked in. And so it is about time that after 50 years, the United States changed posture. I mean, again, as the president said, we've been at this for 50 years, and still Cuba is communist. We've been at this for 50 years, and we have normalized relations with another communist country, China. We've normalized relations with Vietnam, a country we went to war with, and we lost lots of men and women on the battlefield there, and yet we can't normalize relations with a country that's 90 miles to our south, where many people fled and came to the United States, and they're in Florida and throughout the country, who would like to see their families back in Cuba, would like to travel freely to Cuba. Lots of Americans would like to go to Cuba. And so, you know, this is a policy change that should have happened a long time ago, but for lots of reasons, which I think we'll get into in a moment, the political pressure was made to bear against members of Congress and certainly against people sitting in the Oval Office to not change the policy or do what President Obama did today.
Let me address that a minute, Julia. Bloomberg had a piece today about the strength of the Cuba lobby. The author writes, quote, "Since the end of the Cold War, independent foreign policy experts have argued that U.S. interests would be served by opening relations with Cuba. But U.S. policy until now hasn't really changed, And the reason has been the effectiveness of the anti-Castro Cuba lobby. Who is the Cuba lobby, and why don't they want to change?
The Cuba lobby has, I think that phrase almost doesn't even work anymore, because in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was an organization that had an office in Washington, and they actively lobbied members of Congress, and there was Cuba PAC money, which there still is, although much less. It was accurate to say there was a lobby. Now there's a foyer or a doorway with 4 or 5 members of Congress in it who represent constituents who do deeply care about this issue, but it's much more a kind of shadow legacy that President Obama is exposing, pulling the curtains back on, and showing that actually the Cuban American community, not the representatives in Congress, and not this lobby, has now organic ties with the island of Cuba, is sending their kids for summer and spring vacation, is sending $2 billion of remittances every year, and that money is investing in Cuban small businesses already. The South Florida economy has benefited from this, and so that lobby, I think, is really atrophying, and that's what today's move and what we're going to see going forward is going to further expose. Now, that doesn't mean that Senator Rubio and Senator Menendez and others aren't going to try to stop this process, but because the ties are organic, or as President McKinley once said, of singular intimacy between the two countries, that dynamic, I think, that old lobby, that shadow of a lobby, is going to have a hard time stopping, especially because in Cuba, this is going to be so well received by the Cuban people.
Jonathan, the President Obama, has been able to do this, and no president, even Democrats before him, have been able to even come near trying to normalize relations. How do you view this in the whole view of other presidents not being able to move at all in trying to advance this policy toward normalization?
Well, sure. I mean, on the surface, it's historic. No, as you said, no other president has been able to do this. But also, when you think of the political calculations and how the Republican Party in particular used position on Cuba as a cudgel against Democrats or anyone who wanted to normalize relations, what the president did today was not historic, but brave. I think that's why a lot of people are looking at what the president did with sort of, neck snapping. Whoa, he actually did it, when we know that presidents who preceded him have been pushed, requested, asked, please, would you even consider doing this? And here we have a president who, in league with the Pope Francis, was actually able to do this. And again, we're looking at a president who is in the last 2 years of his second term, who a lot of people would like to look at as a lame duck. But when you take this into account and what he did on the executive action on immigration, this is a president who is showing that he is not going to be lame. And one other point, Rev, the Republican Party and lots of folks on the other side like to say that this president is turning his back on freedom and democracy for the people of Cuba. And I have to say that the oxygen of democracy is freedom, particularly the free flow of ideas. Yeah. You get Americans going down to Cuba more than just folks visiting on tours that are now sanctioned. Those ideas that they will bring with them to Cuba and that they will bring from Cuba back to the United States will only make it easier and more possible for the people of Cuba to experience the freedom we think they should have.
Well, another big day is a huge day for the not so lame duck President Obama. Jonathan Capehart, Julia Swag, thank you both for your time tonight.
Thanks, Reb.
Thank you.
Breaking news out of Hollywood tonight. U.S. officials say there's a link to North Korea to the Sony hacking. And our panel takes on President Obama's historic move on Cuba. Stay with us.
I'm thrilled today. I want to thank President Obama, Pope Francis, the Canadian government for the efforts that went into this huge breakthrough in Cuban-American relations.